Welcome, Lauriane and Kolja. Today we speak about the missile technology control regime. Lauriane, if I start with you, can you tell us what is the missile technology control regime and why is it relevant?
Thank you, Steph. Yes, the missile technology control regime, or the MTCR, is actually one of the cornerstones of the international non-proliferation regime today, and the main export control instrument for missiles. It has grown to 35 members nowadays, and that includes most suppliers of relevant missile and space launch vehicle technology, although some key suppliers also remain outside. We can cite, for instance, China, Pakistan, or Iran. The role of the missile technology control regime is to provide guidelines and also maintain control lists to control the transfer of sensitive missile technology as well as relevant dual-use goods and technology.
Thank you. And you and Kolja, you have a report out these days where you state, Kolja, I'm turning to you now, where you state that the MTCR regime is at a crossroads right now and is facing several challenges. Can you tell us what do you mean with the crossroads and what challenges does the regime face?
Thank you, Steph. Indeed, the MTCR is in a quite difficult situation today, particularly in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that began in February of last year and the repercussions that we're seeing emanating from that. Because in the context of the MTCR, both Russia and Ukraine are members of the MTCR, and all decisions in the regime are taken by consensus. So only one member disagreeing is already enough to derail a whole process within the MTCR. And we are unfortunately seeing this play out already. There's also a whole number of other challenges that necessarily the regime needs to address, but we're being slowed down by this larger situation. And so it's a really difficult situation that the regime is facing right now, and decisions need to be made about what direction the regime wants to take in the future.
And you mentioned that a bit already, like that there's more challenges overall. What would you say is of particular concern there?
Yeah, there is a whole set of challenges that also relates to the operation, to the work, and to some particular topics that the MTCR has to deal with. The first already that goes back to the membership that Lauriane mentioned. Not all countries which have missile technology or who have the dual-use technology that can be used for missiles are in the regime, but the regime hasn't really been growing in the last few years. India was the one exception of a new member joining recently, but beyond that, membership has stagnated. At the same time, the regime members want more non-members to adhere to the regime, so politically declare that they follow the guidelines and use the control lists, but very few states have done that using the tools that the regime provides. Some follow the standards, actually quite a large group follow the standards, but not so many engage through the adherence instrument. The next point worth mentioning that goes to the transparency of the regime, because the work is quite sensitive, and so because of that, the meetings aren't public. There's only very few public statements which don't have a lot of substance that we actually get to know on the outside, and so the regime, and particularly the way that it communicates, is often perceived as being somewhat intransparent. And the other thing is that the regime creates a lot of good guidance. They're communicating about a lot of issues that are of concern for other states as well, but not a lot of this is publicized. So that brings a certain issue as well, which brings me naturally to the next area, which is legitimacy. The MTCR is a relatively closed group, and it's not been created in the context of the United Nations. It's not really open for states to just go and sign up, but it's being perceived as this closed club, and that legacy still carries on. Although now we have obligations for all states to have export controls that come from United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540, and so this was already a good step in that direction, but still this legacy carries on to a certain extent. And this then plays out in terms of how some of the content work of the regime is unfolding. Emerging technologies are still an issue with the speed of development, and sometimes also cutting across to regimes which cover different areas. But the other thing that certainly has to be highlighted now is the geopolitical context that presents another area of challenges for the MTCR. And this is not just the specific context of the war in Ukraine that we're now seeing, but this also goes beyond that and particularly concerns the geoeconomic competition that we're seeing, particularly between the United States and China. But this has really become a much broader issue now and is drawing in many of the states that are part of the MTCR. And this goes back to sensitive technologies, what is part of this competition now, and it's all being drawn into that, as well as the use of export controls as more of a tool for competition rather than just as a tool for non-proliferation, as was envisioned by the MTCR.
Thank you, Kolja. That was indeed a really complex picture. In your report, what recommendations, Lauriane, do you have for the states participating in the MTCR to address the situation?
So I'll try to focus on 4 areas where we made those recommendations. The first one is on how to really strengthen membership and adherence. In this area, an important thing would be for MTCR partners to develop a clear strategy with a list of objectives on how really to strengthen both of these. And also to look at how to better engage with adherents in particular, and sort of showing them the benefits of this tool. A second area where we made recommendations is on how to improve transparency within the regime. To do this, the MTCR partners can make better use really of communication tools that are at their disposal, also being more consistent in the way that they communicate the important work of the regime. And another example would be to publish the guidance material that is already available. The third area that we looked at, legitimacy. In this area, an important recommendation would be to link the work of the regime and the shared norm of missile non-proliferation with the other instruments in the field, so UN Security Council Resolution 1540, but also the Hague Code of Conduct against ballistic missile proliferation, for instance. And if and where relevant, to also look into conducting inter-regime dialogue with the other export control regimes that are here and that share some of the same challenges and concerns. And the last area that we looked at, geopolitical tensions. Here what we found is that an important value of the MTCR is the important technical work that it conducts. And continuing and strengthening this technical work within the regime is really key.
Thank you, Lauriane, really. And if I turn back to you, Kolja, what does the current situation of the MTCR mean for the wider landscape of missile non-proliferation?
To many extents, it actually reflects a broader situation that we're seeing with the multilateral export control regimes. So many of the challenges that relate to the operation of the regime, to some of the topics, for example, emerging technologies, these challenges and the issues actually cut across the regimes. At the same time, particularly the geopolitical impact is something that we're seeing not only confined to this area of export controls, but it's also playing out in the wider missile arms control field as a whole. You know, we've already seen the demise of the INF Treaty in the past, but also now more recently the issues that are unfolding with regard to the New START Treaty. So unfortunately, this is really reflecting the difficulties that we're seeing across the board. With that said, I think looking at our report, we're also at least a little bit hopeful that some of the recommendations that we're formulating also apply across at least to the other export control regimes. There's certain areas where many of them can improve, and some solutions actually involve multiple of the regimes cooperating better, working better with the arms control instruments that are there in their areas. So we hope that at least with the report we give some starting points where we can improve in these areas across the board.
Thank you both, and congratulations again to your important report.